Hello, everybody. My name is Tim Downs. I'm the executive producer of ConnectX All Access. Welcome to what I believe is going to be a terrific 55-minute session focused on CBRS. We have three people joining us today. First of all, we're very pleased to have FCC Commissioner Michael O'Reilly joining us for the first 15-minute discussion. And then following Commissioner O'Reilly, we'll bring in Dave Wright of the CBRS Alliance and John Gilbert of Rudin Management Company to talk more about CBRS. Commissioner O'Reilly, I'll start with you. Sure. This session, as we teed it up, is called CBRS, the right solution for a new normal of work and education. And it just seems to me that it's a great time to talk about CBRS. We're going through an interesting time socially, an interesting time with the way work and education has evolved really quickly. And CBRS seems to be a really terrific networking solution for these times. Why don't you give us a little bit more background on just the evolution of CBRS and how it was designed to meet some of the local private uses and as well as the use cases for fixed and mobile operators.
Well, sure. First, so much thank you for having me. I much appreciated extending my thanks to the guests as well. I'm sure it'll be an exciting panel after I leave here. But to your point, very valid. And I want to give credit to where credit is due. It's not just been this commission, it's previous commissions that worked really hard to get us to this point. Julius Janikowski, Tom Wheeler days. I came during the Tom Wheeler days and we worked hard when I was in the minority. And then we did some things recently in the changes during the Pi days to make this more operational. So I'm really excited to where we are. The cases you talk about and the instances where we may see operations, and we're starting to see that in the GAA side of the equation, really exciting things. I've been kind of stepping back a little bit. We're going to let the market take the direction it wants to go in terms of where it's best to be used. In these moments that we live in, though, it's not lost on me that connectivity is so much, so needed. We've done a lot of work on Wi-Fi issues at this commission on unlicensed spectrum. But here's an opportunity to take a band that really was congested. It's hard to say anything else because you have Navy radar operating when needed for national security purposes. So we couldn't have something that operated all the time, and getting them out was going to be too complex. So what we've created is a three-tiered structure, including the unlicensed like service of GAA, and now we're just about ready to go to auction on the priority access licenses in July 23rd. Just a couple weeks away. It's really exciting to see where this is going to go and who buys licenses. We're going to know in a couple of weeks what we'll have a status PN, so I know who actually applied. I actually didn't sign the confidentiality, so I didn't say anything inappropriate and change market events. So I'm interested to see who's applied for the auction and the short forms and who's ready to bid.
Yeah, that's a great point. We'll get to the PAL auction, the Priority Access License auction, in a minute. But before we do that, I'd like to circle back to, it was only 5 months ago that full commercial deployment of CBRS was authorized. Since that time, in the 5 months, granted it's been an interesting economy and et cetera, but has the deployment of base stations and the device manufacturing community met with your expectations when it comes to CBRS technology?
Well, I think that's absolutely. I think that what you're seeing is that the companies are out in the field establishing and installing equipment, and that's a good thing. And the SASs are operational, the ESCs are operational, and everyone's going full blown on GAA, and that's really exciting from my perspective. I saw a story yesterday that said between March and April, the traffic and the amount of usage of GAA has doubled. And we can only imagine what it's going to be in the next couple of months. And then you add the priority access licenses. So I've been pretty pleased with where we're at, given the time period and also given the economic circumstances that we're facing. Many companies have probably pulled back some investment and decided to put off projects. But even with those circumstances, we're seeing growth in this segment. And it's only interesting to, CBRS is the first of what may be many. There are going to be a number of cases where we can use this approach going forward, where we can't do cleared licenses, we can't do cleared spectrum, and this may be this is the tip of the iceberg, in my opinion.
Oh, that's great. That would be really interesting to have shared spectrum and other bands. I believe that's been the goal all along. Let's switch gears and do talk about the PAL auction,
Sure.
the Priority Access License auction. That's starting in July. Do you think that the pandemic or the economy as it stands now will affect the auction? And then secondly, who do you expect will be the primary participants in the auction?
The first part of your question is a little bit tough, and the second part is even more difficult.
Yeah.
We've already delayed the auction by give or take a month, and I'd be surprised if we had to delay it again. I feel that though the times are economically challenging, the companies are ready. Those that have shown interest in the past, those who have filed short forms, are ready for this to happen. And I think we haven't seen a backtracking from a number of the tower equipment guys, and I don't think we're going to see it from those that are on the front end. So I believe that we should be able to go forward. It's still to be determined, and that's the chairman's call, and he can present something to change that up. But I'd like to believe we can move forward despite what's happening elsewhere. But to your second part of who would be the potential bidders and who may the case studies or the cases may be developed and who may use it for what, that's to be determined. When I get the status PN out in the next couple of weeks, we'll have a better feel of who's actually applied, how many have applied, and then I can probably figure out a little bit more specificity of what they might use it for. We've heard what the large wireless companies might use it for. Someone talked about backhaul. Someone talked about maybe doing a full private 5G offering, and so we'll have to see some of those things going forward. Some of the small guys, fixed wireless services, absolutely possible in this universe. And then the industrial component. I was reading yesterday about a couple good stories about how some of the GAA has been used, and we'll be interested to see if we get some people who want to, or some entities that want to take PALs and then use the secondary market to partition those out in some capacity for more industrial uses in certain places. Really exciting times where we're at the beginning of a new approach to spectrum policy that can be used in certain circumstances.
Yeah, I agree. And so do you think that some of these industrial enterprises and possibly healthcare organizations or even large universities, et cetera, would opt for, and this is just your opinion, GAA in their facility, or do you think they would opt for the protected environment around a license? Do you have any?
Yeah, I can envision where you can see some mixture, right? That these are 10 megahertz licenses. You may not need the full 40 because it's capped at 40 out of 70. You may only need 10, and you might want some that you can guarantee on, and then you can use GAA. It depends also where they're located, how popular, how close you are to an urban center where there might be more competition compared to a more rural area, to know how GAA is going to be fought over in those circumstances. So I think that each case is a little different. The users will have to determine how best. Some may go for priority access licenses. Some may rely on a provider and then lease off of that circumstance. And some may want to partition out. We'll just have to see a little bit. I think in 6 months we're going to have a really great case study and be able to put a lot of data points on the board to know exactly how this is at least initiated going forward.
Yeah, I agree. 6 months from now, we'll be hopefully having another one of these and discussing what we just learned. But that also brings up, when it comes to the auction, a post-auction secondary market. Typically, it has, those kinds of markets haven't been that robust. But this might be different, don't you think? With
oh, absolutely.
CBRS?
Yeah, this is absolutely. We've not only have we blessed it, we've actually promoted it. And so we can see some that combined with user share is going to be a really interesting case for those different entities to where they want to go and what they want to use it for, given the limitations and the costs and different things that will go into it. So I think it's a different approach by having such a strong secondary market, and then we'll see how many licenses are taken. Whether the commission needs to do in the short term another auction. I tend to believe right now, without seeing too much, there's going to be enough demand early on. There won't be a ton of licenses left over, but we'll just have to see.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. So transitioning a little bit away from the auction, let's talk about the Alliance and the CBRS community pushing towards a roadmap to 5G. I know that the 5G new radio specs have come out, and Is that a roadmap between CBRS and 5G that's important to the commission? And discuss that a little bit. Who would that be most impacted by?
Sure. Well, I really appreciate the work that the Alliance has done to deal with the current standards, that have been set and are working on in 5G, and make sure that they're compatible. In this case, we're going to have to see what that means. But I think that they've done yeoman's work. When years ago we were told by many people, I was laughed at for the idea that there would be 5G in CBRS, and now we know that is actually going to happen. The hard work has been done. The case studies the examples have been done. The experiments, all the testing has been done. It's right there, and I really appreciate the work that the Alliance has done to make this happen.
Well, and that also begs the question of how does CBRS fit into the Commission's C-band approach, right? There's a whole now emphasis on mid-band, et cetera, for all entrants, all carriers, and other stakeholders in the system. So does that change anything, or can you comment a little bit about the C-band and
Sure.
how CBRS impacts that?
Well, I think the two are going to run, the little different case studies and little different experiences and what we're expecting. It may change over time, but right now, what providers may use C-band for our traditional 5G services, we may say a little different in CBRS. And that's okay. That you can have providers that want to buy in both markets, and that's a good experience, in my opinion. So I don't think they're fighting each other. I think they're not synonymous right now. You probably wouldn't jump from one to the other. I think over time they're going to be. I think that 5G and CBRS is a natural fit, and it's not going to be an exclusionary situation in just small places. It's going to be full blown because the carriers are going to take advantage of it. And so the over time period, I think they're going to be more uniform. But right now, I think you're going to see different case studies of what it's used for, and that's a good thing. We'll get to see, we'll get all those data points.
Yeah. So we only have a few minutes left here. Let me ask you, you touched on this a little earlier. The 3-tiered spectrum sharing framework that CBRS is really a hallmark of is really innovative. And how has that been received? How has the Commission received, other countries, other areas, their policymakers, their regulators? How are they looking at this? Is this the new normal?
Well, a lot of credit is due to all the different participants, including DoD, and their willingness to change over time. This probably wasn't their first point, but now when you talk to them, they're very interested in shared spectrum. I appreciate the work that they and the commitments they've given to me. One of the conferences, they made clear that they're willing to increase the power limits for the private side, and therefore wouldn't be a problem. It'll take a little bit of time to get there, but that's a good commitment from them. But your point is well taken, that internationally, my conversations with a number of regulators, they're very much interested in what's happening in CBRS, not just the GAA, but the PALs as well, and how we've structured it. That is something they see as a really a possibility that they could deploy in certain instances, just like we can. It's not going to be the be-all, end-all. It's a tool in the toolbox, but a really exciting tool, one you have to have. And so I think they're looking at it going, this really can work. All the work that's gone in, all the effort that's gone in is finally coming to an end, and everyone else is just in awe from my conversations. I'm really impressed they were able to get to this point and really solves a number of problems going forward.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. It's a very big, bright light in our industry right now, and it's a time we could really use it. So it's going to be an interesting rest of the year. I can't thank you enough for taking the time to talk to us today. You've been a great cheerleader and influencer in the CBRS community. On behalf of the Alliance, who's bringing us this panel, thanks again for your time. Thanks again for everything you're doing for CBRS.
Thank you so much for having me. It's much appreciated. And go get them.
Thank you, Commissioner Michael O'Reilly. Thanks again. All right. I think it's time to introduce our next two panelists. We have Dave Wright. Dave is the president of the CBRS Alliance. And we also have John Gilbert. John is the chief operating officer of Rudin Management Company. This is a good opportunity to discuss the commercialization of CBRS and how it's playing out in at least one sector of our world, the commercial real estate and commercial management. Dave, I'm going to kick it off with you. Why don't you talk a little bit about your background with the Alliance, how you see this year has been with the Alliance and the progress that CBRS has made, and then we'll go over to John.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Tim. And I want to thank the Commissioner and John for joining us here today. The Alliance has been participating with the WIA as a sponsor of ConnectX, I think, for the last 3 years. So we're proud to do that again this year, and proud to be a part of the panel. So to answer your question in terms of my involvement with the Alliance, I've been involved since even before the Alliance was launched. So back, I think, in the late 2015 timeframe, a number of companies came together, looked at what was happening within industry to commercialize CBRS, and felt that there's a bit of a back end. There's a lot of great work going on in terms of implementing the framework, how these databases or spectrum access systems would talk to the radios, and how we would protect DoD, as the Commissioner was talking about. A lot of the foundational work was going on, but there wasn't work going on specifically focusing on cellular technologies operating in this band. So, we came together and we said, we really need to make sure that LTE today and 5G new radio tomorrow, or now today, back then it was tomorrow, can operate as effectively and as optimized as possible in this band. So, again, 6 founding members launched the organization August of 2016. I was secretary at that point, became president in early 18. We're now 163 member companies. Really focusing on technical development, and where there are gaps. We're not trying to recreate the wheel or do something that duplicate effort where it's being done elsewhere. So we're looking at what 3GPP has done. We're looking at what organizations like WinForum have done, sister organizations like Multi-Fire Alliance, Small Cell Forum, et cetera. And then anywhere that there are gaps that are going to become an impediment or, make it suboptimal to deploy cellular technologies in the band, we've got a technology working group or technical working group that comes in, does the work to fill those gaps. And that's the different 3 releases that we've put out so far of our technical specs. Another big area of effort for us is around certification. So we want to create an interoperable ecosystem. I think it's going to be very important, especially as we start talking about some of these vertical sectors. There are ecosystems of, infrastructure equipment, client equipment, people who really understand the business needs, the integrators, who can come in and deliver a solution to people like John and others in the healthcare or the educational sectors as well. Pardon me. So we're working on that both in our certification, creating interoperable equipment. We've also got a deployment working group that's looking at just how to provide information and collateral that will help people deploy these networks who don't have a background. And so this is obviously not targeted to the network operators who are intimately familiar with deploying cellular technologies, but more to the private use cases and potentially neutral host use cases going forward. In terms of what this year's been, 2020 has been great. You talked about, we got the FCD, that is the full commercial authorization back in late January for GAA services. That was the authorization of the first 4 spectrum access systems to operate in the band. Since that time, we've seen tens of thousands of radios deployed. Actually, I'll just leave it at tens of thousands. I've got to be careful not to say anything that I shouldn't hear. There's a lot of confidentiality around the SAS information, but we've got tens of thousands of radios deployed. It's a mix of both the Category A and the Category B radios. So that's the lower power, like 1 watt radiated power Cat A, largely indoor. They can be deployed outdoor as well. And the Category B is the higher power, up to 50 watts of radiated power, outdoor only. We've got a mix of those Category A and Category B radios out there, really supporting a range of use cases. So I don't want to take up too much more time. I'll talk about use cases hopefully in the future. I did want to note, I really like your poster. It seems very apropos to our panel. So,
yeah, like that. Well, John, let me toss it to you, John Gilbert. One of the sectors that the CBRS ecosystem has been really, really excited about helping to solve problems for is your industry, the commercial real estate, commercial building, tenant developer, people like that. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your company, your role in the company, and the role that you see technology and maybe even connectivity playing going forward in a world where tenants need more bandwidth, maybe more remote capability, et cetera?
Sure. Well, I thank you, and thanks for the opportunity. I'm Chief Operating Officer for a family-owned business in New York that owns and operates 15 million square feet, 10 of it office and 5 of it residential. And back in the mid-'90s, we had a vacant building at 55 Broad Street that had been vacant for over 5 years. And we, after the internet was created, we said, well, wait a minute, how does real estate relate to this? And what we saw was that there was a huge relationship. And what we did was we were one of the first to actually create optical fiber to the desktop. And at that time, we said that the real estate moniker of location, location, location will be forever changed to location, bandwidth, location. Because it's great if you had a great physical location, but if you weren't able to access global marketplaces with optical fiber, then you weren't going to be able to compete. And what we see, the CBRS opportunity is exactly the same, except now it's wireless and now it's mobile, and now there's a big fat pipe that ultimately we can connect to and ultimately solve a lot of problems that we've had trouble solving. The first and foremost is ultimately creating that central nervous system. Buildings have always had a heart, engine room, boiler room. They now have a brain. We've created software that allows all the data that buildings generate to come to a single place. It's called Nantum. So the brain is there. Now what's the final frontier is the central nervous system. And as we try to go, one thing we know as fact, and this is indisputable, is that the more data that we can collect, the more granular data that we can collect, the more efficiently we can run our buildings. Full stop, period, exclamation point. And CBRS, in my humble opinion, will allow us to grab that very granular data on a floor-by-floor basis as we deploy these radios throughout our built environments without interfering with any existing networks. I don't want to touch my tenants' networks. They don't want me touching their networks. But what CBRS allows me to do is to collect occupancy data, is to collect space utilization data, understand it, wrap machine learning algorithms around it, identify those patterns, memorize those patterns, learn from those patterns, and do a better job tomorrow than I did today simply because I've got more information and more knowledge in order to do that. So we see that the CBRS model or the CBRS enablement as a huge game changer within the built environment, especially in the office and multifamily residential spaces.
Wow, that's fascinating. I mean, so CBRS is really an avenue for you to use data, and you're going to use data across the board to improve your bottom line, improve your efficiency, improve your tenant experience. Let me throw it back to Dave and say, Dave, is John Gilbert just the leading edge of the spear here, and he's just so far out there that he knows all this, or is he indicative of the kind of other companies that you see in the CBRS ecosystem, from, say, maybe higher education to industrial enterprise? I know there's some ports that are doing this, but I don't know if everyone is as advanced as John is in their knowledge of what CBRS can do.
Right. Thanks, Tim. Well, first of all, I think John is definitely, cutting edge in terms of, how he thinks about technology and how it applies to the commercial property sector. And, you can see that with the fiber initiatives they took before really anybody else had done that. It seems like he's on the leading edge with CBRS as well. So I want to give him credit for that. I do see some other visionaries in other sectors as well. But just maybe backing up for 1 second, I'd like to take it up to about 30,000 feet and say, at a high level, it's important for everybody to understand that the opportunities with CBRS, as I think the commissioner alluded to before, and you sort of asked, alluded to in the question to him, there are a lot of operator use cases for CBRS, right, or applications. So mobile broadband, the obvious one, right? So the tier one mobile operators and tier twos even, would like to use this to augment the capacity of their licensed spectrum bands, particularly, until the C-band spectrum that you talked about before is available. So I think that one is relatively straightforward. Other operators who may want to get into mobile broadband but haven't had the spectrum assets to do so may leverage CBRS to do that. Then there's a whole other wave of equipment activity deployments that's going on around fixed wireless access using CBRS. And some of that's due to the incumbent situation where we had a lot of Part 90 fixed wireless operators in the upper 50 megahertz of the band, and now they can harness the whole 150 megahertz. Some of it's just due to the availability of cellular technologies and the price points that you can get with a mass market technology like LTE and 5G in the future. So those are really the major operator categories. Then you were asking mostly about what's going on in the private space. Yes, I think, there are a number of vertical sectors that have expressed, for a long time now, have expressed, keen desire to harness CBRS and the new capabilities that will enable for them. Obviously, commercial property, as we have John here to speak to, but sectors like education, healthcare in particular, transportation and logistics, ports, rail yards, even airfields that are owned by these logistics handling companies. And then finally, power production, energy production has been another sector where there's been a lot of activity. In fact, the commissioner can tell you that a lot of those parties were very active in the conversations about what the PAL licenses ought to look like. And they've continued to be very, active in the formation of the ecosystem since then. I think it's also, reflected in the types of equipment that's available, particularly on the client side. We track the different clients that have received FCC authorization to operate in the band. And as of about a week ago, there were 80 different clients authorized for the band. And it includes the form factors that you'd think. So, the iPhone 11, the Pixel 4, Samsung Galaxy 10, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of smartphones, the latest iPad, one of the Galaxy Notes from Samsung as well. So phones, tablets, but then, some new laptops have CBRS capabilities in them. And probably more importantly, you get, IoT modules that are either consumer packaging or ruggedized industrial packaging with a CBRS capability in them for different industrial and enterprise applications. Gateway devices, so things that'll turn an Ethernet connection or a serial connection and bridge that to a CBRS Airlink. And then CPE. So for the fixed wireless access market, there's a whole host of different consumer premises equipment that's got a CBRS radio that connects to a fixed wireless, access point or base station somewhere off in the distance to provide residential broadband, typically. And then there's some specialized equipment available as well. Cameras, video seems to be one of the big ones that's coming on strong. Monitoring, and I think that applies across virtually every different vertical that I've talked about. They all have needs to have, monitoring of assets or security monitoring. Ports have talked about using cameras just to monitor their cranes instead of having to send a guy, up there to climb 200 foot out on the boom of a crane. They can use just put a camera out there and use that to do the maintenance and preventative maintenance on the equipment. Barcode scanners. It's really quite amazing the different equipment that's coming out for the band, and I think that's just going to continue to reflect the different use cases that people have for it.
Great. So back to you, John. You had mentioned that your company is using the data you can generate from CBRS. Can you talk a little bit about you're the company that brought fiber to the desktop. How is CBRS and the connectivity it enables, is that changing the relationship your tenants are looking for from their building management? Is that how are you utilizing that functionality? Fiber brought a ton of bandwidth. CBRS brings bandwidth, mobility. Is there a connectivity play there that's just straight up for tenants?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think we're living in the COVID-19 pandemic, and our lobbies as we reoccupy our buildings, and that should be happening sometime this month. But we've had to do a lot of planning. And one of the things that we also know as fact is that our lobbies will never be viewed or used the same post COVID-19. There will be lines. We will have to restrict the number of people that go up in our vertical transportation. Well, what are people going to be doing when they're standing in that line waiting to get into an elevator? If there's not enough bandwidth in that lobby to ultimately for them to be able to connect, make a phone call, answer a text, answer an email, look at video, then they're not going to be very happy. So we see this as a big enabler to increase the amount of bandwidth, utilize that big wireless pipe as people are standing in queues, either waiting to get a thermal scan or waiting to get into an elevator or whatever. We've never had to queue up in our lobbies before. Now we will. I think another example, as we've seen the civil unrest that has occurred, obviously security is paramount, and the ability to take cameras and to put them into dark spots that weren't able to be viewed before, CBRS enables that, because ultimately that bandwidth, that just give me 10 megahertz of that spectrum, and I can push wireless video. If I can power up that camera, if I can either put it on a battery pack or plug it into an outlet, now suddenly I have network capacity video in real time. Hugely important and hugely valuable to anybody who owns any real estate in any major city in the United States right now. And I think the real key to from our standpoint, people say data is the new oil. Well, it's crude oil, and unless you have the ability to grab that data efficiently and effectively, and unless you have software that can refine that data to make it valuable, then all you have is big, glumpy, thick goo that isn't worth very much. So the ability to grab the data, refine it, make it valuable, wrap machine learning and artificial intelligence around it, so that ultimately that data can be made valuable and useful, that to me is the holy grail. And that to me is where each and every property owner in the United States needs to go to and get to in order for us to do our job properly. One of the things that we do right now is we grab occupancy data and we correlate that occupancy data against fan speed. Now, what does that mean? Well, what it means is we're able to shrink our operational day, save money. We're able to, in the middle of the day, as people go to lunch, our current occupancy sensors scream to the gateway, hey, gateway, tell the BMS that there are people leaving the building, and with those people leaving the building is a significant amount of heat load, i.e. slow down the fans. We don't have to push as much volumetric air, saving an enormous amount of energy. We've cut our electrical spend by 41% simply by using data that we were already collecting, but not correlating against other data sets. So again, I can't emphasize enough how CBRS becomes the enabler to that central nervous system that is so important ultimately to become as granular as we possibly can, grab as much data as we possibly can, and allow software systems like Nantum to refine it and make it valuable.
That's great. Let me ask you this then. The central nervous system you just spoke about, who owns that? There is a clearly a movement of growth in neutral host network operators, whether that's the building owner, such as yourself, or whether that's a third party that you allow to come in, and that's their businesses to own and operate, maintain, et cetera, give you the benefit. How do you see that? And that's still shaking out in many ways, the neutral host network model. But discuss the central nervous system for Rudin and who owns it. Do you guys do that? Do you invest in it? Do you allow someone else to come in and do the investment?
Well, we're pretty clear in terms of who owns the data in our buildings, and that's us. If somebody walks in our door and says, hey, I got a great app and I want to deploy it in your building, but they own the data, that's a very short meeting. and that person can, go try to convince somebody else that that's the right way to go. They're not going to convince us. In terms of the payment for the infrastructure, there are several different models that we think are right. Number one, I don't really want to get into introducing carriers to my customers. That can be done by a third party. What I want is my 10 megahertz spectrum, 10 megahertz pipe. Let me do what I want to do. That's my data. I own it. And if that third party neutral host operator wants to ultimately run everything else within the building in terms of talking to the carriers, talking to my customers, making those marriages, God bless. That's fine with me. That's not my core business. I'm just really focused on what my core business is, and ultimately delivering a level of service and an experience. One of the things that we've also done with Nantum is we've cut our hot and cold calls by 75 to 80%. So I'm saving money, and I'm enhancing the experience and level of comfort to my customers. That's what I want to do. I'm not interested in ultimately being a carrier. I don't want to be a carrier, not my core business. I want to enable carriers to come into our buildings. We want multiple choice of carriers. That's what we did back in 1995. Carrier neutral risers do three things. It gives the tenant multiple choice. It gives the carrier a just plug-in infrastructure, and it gives me the ability to sleep at night knowing I'm not going to have spaghetti in my vertical risers. It's a triple win. So now ultimately we can do that same model within the wireless spectrum using CBRS, and that's what we're hoping to do.
Dave, let me toss it to you. This model of the neutral host environment growing and serving a need both to John and both to the carriers as well as the tenants is a key component of why CBRS is where it is today. And it's especially kind of appropriate because we're speaking to the WIA audience and the stakeholders and towers and infrastructure owners, et cetera. So talk a little bit about how the Alliance sees the neutral host network operator emerging, growing, and prospering in this new world order.
Sure. And I just want to say I really appreciated John's comments and even sort of the history of, what neutral fiberizers meant, to his industry, because I have that, I didn't have that historical experience, but that's been my theorem all along for why CBRS is different, is a different enabler for the carriers in terms of building coverage with a neutral host. We've had small cell solutions around for 10, 12 years now, I think. And, I think it's safe to say that we really haven't seen the uptake or the traction of those in the enterprise that a lot of people had predicted. And to my mind, it's exactly what John articulated. It's the spaghetti of having, 3 different small cell deployments in my facility, one per operator, because it has to match up to their specific license bands. CBRS solves the problem. It's a neutral spectrum range, right? So I can hang these radios. John can hang these radios in his properties, use them for his private communications need, gather the data that he's talked about to optimize his building and wreak out some efficiency savings. But then in the future, look at enabling, different carriers to come onto that neutral infrastructure, neutral spectrum. We talked about the different phones that are coming out now with the band 48, which is the 3GPP band definition for LTE and CBRS. So there's a number of phones out there that support it, like the iPhone 11, right? This guy right here. And I have a CBRS network here in my house, so anyone wants to know. Haven't connected it to a carrier just yet, but if anybody wants to do that, let me know. But that's the idea, right? There's no reason that this phone couldn't connect me back to my mobile operator. We would just have to have some signaling enabled that would say, AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, whoever's network is reachable via this neutral host network that I'm operating here in my home. And the same thing would apply with John's properties. So, to answer your question, what's the Alliance doing to enable that? We've done a lot of work to enable that. So within our technical group, we've got a network services task group that's got neutral host as one of its primary focuses, and they've done a lot of work, and we have different specifications out now defining neutral host architectures. We've worked with Addis, which does all the cellular number assignments for North America, to secure cellular identifiers, including IMSIs, which are the SIM blocks, essentially, or the blocks of identifiers that go in a SIM. For neutral host deployments, so people can come to the Alliance and actually receive, IMSIs, have SIMs produced, and that's, again, more for private today, but you can use those identifiers in the future for neutral host. And then our deployment operations and business working groups are also looking very closely at, what are the business relationships? And frankly, that's where, the work largely remains to be done. I think it's largely accepted that 85% of cellular usage occurs in building, or data usage occurs in building. So I think it's, definitely in the carrier's interest to find ways to get in building to retain that subscriber relationship. And if John's got CBRS networks deployed in his properties, why wouldn't AT&T, Verizon, T-Mo want to find a way to work with him and gain access to their subscribers in those properties? I think it's logical. It's somewhat inevitable that those business issues will get worked out. One other thing, but I know we're running short on time.
Yeah, well, so we only have a few minutes left. Let me take it and just toss two questions at both you guys, or one question. John, first with you. You just mentioned you were talking about fiber and neutral risers, et cetera, 20 years ago. Where do you see this next year? Where do you see you talking about connectivity a year from now? Will you still be talking about CBRS, or will you be talking about, or will it never come up because you will have a plug and play neutral host network and you're doing all sorts of great stuff on it? Where do you see yourself a year from now relative to CBRS, connectivity, tenant experience?
Well, it's interesting. My grandfather was the guy who actually designed the first transatlantic telephone cable that was successful back in 1955. He worked at Bell Labs. I've got a cut of it on my desk in my office. And so, I think as I look back at him in 1955 when that cable was actually stretched, and thinking, okay, now we can connect continents. But which was unbelievable, at the time. I look at it, very similar to what, Tip O'Neill used to say about politics. It's all local. If I can't connect to a network locally, then I have nothing. We own the old AT&T Long Lines building, which back in the day had 5,000 women that acted as long distance operators, and you'd pick up the phone and you'd get that local operator and say, "Give me a long distance operator," and that would go home run to 32 out in the Americas, and a woman would pick up and say, "What do you want to do?" "I want to talk to my grandmother in Tampa, Florida." Bingo, there you go, one ringy dingy, two ringy dingy. But now at this point, we're going to be pushing video over our cell phones. We do right now. We stream everything. The issue is what's the infrastructure that's going to support that as more and more people grow to this technology, and as more and more bits and bytes of information and terabits and bytes of information needs to be pushed through these networks. And what Dave just said in terms of 80% of all cell phone traffic is generated from within buildings. If I, as a building owner, am not creating a broadband infrastructure that can support that, I'm an idiot. And I'm not going to be able to compete in the world as we know it. So I think, to me, CBRS answers a lot of the questions and solves a lot of the problems that we've been bumping up against as we try to deploy these networks. So I'm going to be talking about CBRS, I think, for a long time. It may go CBRS to, 5G to, whatever. But to me, the customer doesn't care. All they want is a big pipe. It's got to be mobile, and they want to have easy access to it. So that's what we're trying to get to.
And Dave, it's got to be local. That was a great line from John. Local.
Yeah, you can't do much unless you can get on. So, it all starts with the deployment of the infrastructure, and then where you go from there is the exciting part. And again, the message that I'd like to leave people with is, deploy CBRS today to meet your private communications needs, and then you can add the overlay of neutral host multi-carrier support as a future enhancement. So it meets both responsibilities or both capabilities.
Well, Dave, I very much appreciate your time. John Gilbert, I very much appreciate your time. And before you two, Commissioner O'Reilly, it's the same to you. We appreciate your time today. Great discussion. I love it when I learn something from a Zoom conference call, and I certainly did this time. So again, this is Tim Downs. Thanks for joining us at ConnectX All Access. And again, thanks to the CBRS Alliance for bringing this panel to us. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.